Hello, everyone. Today we are going to pick up with World War I. This is chapter 29 in your book, and it is the follow-up to the imperialism chapter that we just completed. With the distance learning continuing, I thought it would be a good opportunity to touch base here, teach this lesson myself, and get us going on a strong foot. The First World War has only three main objectives that we are going to worry about. Part of this distance learning that we are going through is that we have to figure out ways to get to the most important points and get them across to you. So I've written them here below, and you can see them right here. Main objectives and these are the three, literally it, that we need to look at. Number one, causes of the war. That is what we are going to look at today. Number two is how the nature of war changed. So we will talk about things like the advent of the tank, of aircraft, and poisonous gas, and many things that were implemented during World War I that changed warfare forever. And then number three, we are going to talk about the significant effects of the war. So what happened because of it. World War I actually has a lot more to do with how the 20th century and even into our own era, how, to the modern era, how things have played out. And we'll look at some examples of those when it comes time. The most important thing I think that we can do at this point is remember where it is that we need to look to find information out. So that's what I wrote here. What are the resources for this chapter? First of all, it'll be the chapter 29 material in your book. You can read through that chapter, and that'll be step one. Step two would be the materials in the your unit chapter or unit materials folder in your Schoology page. I'll open that up and you can see PowerPoints. You'll see the beginning slide here of the PowerPoint that I'm going to kind of go through today. That'll be in there that you can look at later, and everything else that we'll need. So that's kind of where we're going. Moving forward. And like I said, I'm going to try to scale this back and hit mostly just what we have there with our main objectives. And it'll work. It'll be fine. So more on how we'll assess this later. I have some ideas on how we'll take a look at this. We will likely have at least one quiz, and then we will take a test. At least we'll have a test grade. Likely it will end up being a project of some sort, and I will get more information to you next week on how we are going to play with that and get that sorted out. So I hope everybody's doing all right, and I miss you guys, and let's get to it. The Great War begins, all right, chapter 29, section 1. We will focus mostly on the causes here today, and which is what we said objective 1 was on the previous slide. And so with nothing else to say, let's get to it. The first question I have is, who are these people? I have two pictures here, and you'll see on the left-hand side the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, and on the right-hand side, Gavrilo Princip. Now, Gavrilo Princip was a member of the Black Hand. They were a Serbian nationalist group that wanted independence from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Franz here was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so these people, these three, will be kind of forever linked to the beginnings of World War I. And many of you may already know this, that the Gavrilo over here assassinated Franz Ferdinand and his wife when they were visiting Sarajevo in 1914. And oftentimes people say that's the spark that began World War One. And that could be an answer, or we look at why did World War One start? The assassination of Franz Ferdinand by Gavrilo Princip was the cause, and that would be true. The assassination set off a string of events that we'll look at here today that does indeed end with World War One starting. But if you think about it and stop and think about this real quick for me, what would first of all, who fought in World War One? Well, who were the participants in the First World War? That's an important first question. You might say off the top, Serbia and Austria-Hungary. Correct? That's the first countries you guys probably thought of. The reality is probably not. Probably nobody here thought of Austria-Hungary or Serbia when they thought of World War One. They most recently came out with a movie, 1917, that was focused on British soldiers. You probably knew Germany and maybe listed them. France, of course. Russia, maybe. All right. The United States later on. Okay. So all these countries are involved in more. But the question, and go back to the original question, is why are all those countries involved in a war, a global catastrophe, because a Serbian nationalist killed or assassinated an Austrian archduke and his wife? Does that make any sense? So, and to me, it doesn't. To me, it does not make much sense unless you provide the context. And that's what we're going to kind of talk about next, is that we kind of have to separate the causes of World War II, World War I, into two different categories. Number one, the sequence of events that was started by the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. There's a sequence that triggers, and we'll get to this later, that you go from the assassination and there is a reaction, counter-reaction, all the way up to the declaration of war. But and we'll get to that. That's one part of the cause of World War One. The second kind of avenue that we're going to take for the beginnings of World War One are the underlying root causes. And that's something that we need to think about here. And this relates back to my question of why would the assassination of an Austrian by a Serbian lead to a world war? It wouldn't, unless there were these underlying causes that we're going to talk about. And there are 4 of them. There are 4 underlying causes that we have to look at. And they're all listed here. All right. Militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism. All right there. 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are the underlying causes. Okay. The basic concept here that we would say here, this is the underlying causes of World War One. Okay, they're not as exciting as the assassination. They're not as well known, but they're just as vitally important. And you can see where we're headed with all of this. It's going to end, indeed, with war right here. Okay, the beginning of World War I in August 1914. We'll start with militarism. So, quickly, militarism is the glorification of war and the military. Most European states were militaristic societies by 1914. Germany was in the midst of a huge buildup. Kaiser Wilhelm was the leader of Germany beginning in 1880s, and he had ruled Germany for 30 years, and he was a militaristic leader. He was constantly in a state of jealousy over the British Empire, which was the greatest the world had ever known. You saw that with your imperialism packets, right? You'll remember England was compared to like a great sea monster or an octopus, and its tentacles were grabbing up colonies all around the world. And Germany was jealous of that. Kaiser Wilhelm was jealous of Great Britain's power. And Germany had been recently unified in the 1870s, so it was relatively young. It was an up-and-comer, whereas Great Britain was the established power at the time. And so the German society had always been sort of militaristic, going back to Prussia all the way back to the 1700s, and earlier Frederick the Great, if you remember him. And so it doesn't take a whole lot for Germany to be pulled into this militaristic set of affairs. And going along with militarism is military buildup. All right, Germany built up a huge army on land, and you'll see this word, conscription. Conscription deals with is basically mandatory or compulsory call-up of civilians, as you see here, to military service. Basically, after 1870, the societies were becoming so large in terms of their militaristic focus that they became embroiled in an arms race where each side was trying to build up a larger and larger army. And at a certain point, they grew their armies to the side that they could no longer find volunteers for their militaries, and they had to begin conscription even during peacetime. You may have heard of the draft. We've talked about the draft before in class. Conscription in this case isn't the draft. All right, the draft is something that was instituted during during war, during the Civil War in the United States, during World War I, World War II. It continued until the Vietnam War, and then it ended in the United States. Conscription was something that was done during peacetime by the militaristic societies, and that included Germany, Austria-Hungary, and France, and Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, but it did not include Great Britain. So the question I would say would be, what is it about Great Britain that would prevent them or give them the feeling that they did not need to adopt conscription, and why would their military, or especially their army, why was it okay that they were okay with their army being small compared to all the other powers, Germany, Russia, France, Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary? So that's the first question, I want you to think about as we move forward in this project, okay, or this lesson. So militarism. So we have a bunch of societies in Europe that are building really big armies, and they are glorifying the military and even war. There hadn't been a major war since the 1850s in Europe. So there's multiple generations of Europeans that have no experience with a real war, and none of them had experiences with a industrialized war. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. Alliances, second thing. Basically, these countries divided up into groups. The idea was the countries alone may feel weakened, or they could be isolated and attacked, but if they entered into an alliance with friends, then they could be protected. In other words, if, for instance, the Triple Alliance was entered into by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, if one of those countries was attacked, for instance, if Austria-Hungary got into a war, it would pull Germany and Italy into a war as well. So that would make attacking Austria-Hungary risky or foolish from the outside. The other major alliance that existed at the time was the Triple Entente. That was, as you see here, between France, Russia, and Great Britain. This was entered into shortly before World War I, and it was mostly due to Russia and France's fear, in particular France's fear of the German and Austrian Triple Alliance. Okay, Russia had been an ally of Germany, but Kaiser Wilhelm had basically very little to do with Russia. He disliked the Russians, and he allowed their relationship to go bad. And Russia, because of this feeling that they could no longer trust Germany, decided to push over to France, and that's where the Triple Entente came from. Great Britain is going to join with France and Russia, which you should not assume was a given. Britain and France had been enemies in the Napoleonic Wars, and all the way back to really the 1700s, even into the 1600s, they had been enemies. Even into the Middle Ages, they had been enemies. The 100 Years' War was between those two countries, if you remember. So there's no reason for France and Great Britain to get together, except for, if you remember, militarism. Germany was building a large navy under Kaiser Wilhelm, and that navy threatened Great Britain's most important, jewel in their empire, which was their Royal Navy. So Great Britain wasn't afraid of German expansion in Europe. They were afraid of the German naval expansion overseas and their race for colonies, which brings us to the next item on the list: imperialism. Don't worry about this stuff, okay? Just don't, okay? This is just there to give you an idea that all these empires, and they were all empires, the British Empire, the German Empire, the Austrian Empire, the Russian Empire, they all had wish lists, they all had agendas that they wanted to create and expand whatever power they already had. If you remember the causes of imperialism, which was one of the questions in your packet, the reason imperialism occurred in the first place was partially because of the need for raw materials and markets for the industrialized powers in Europe. So the imperial competition here was not just for and to some degree it was just for pride, but it was also for resources, as the countries with the most the colonies with the most colonies were going to be the ones that had more economic power. And so if one country gained a larger empire, then the others are going to want bigger empires too. That also connects back to militarism, right? Because who's going to hold these empires are going to be the military. So again, don't worry about memorizing or doing anything with this other than understanding that they were competing with each other overseas. So that's the nature of their relationship. It's not a relationship of cooperation and trying to work together to solve problems. It's an environment of competition, rivalry, and distrust. Okay, so that's the point here that we need to take. You may notice that we left one of the isms off, nationalism. And because right here we're back to Franz Ferdinand and the assassination where we started, and we said this was a separate kind of deal. We wanted to learn the four underlying causes, and then now we're going to look at the spark or trigger, whatever you're going to call it, and then the sequence. There's going to be a sequence of events that follow Franz Ferdinand's assassination. Nationalism is something we already did. We talked about that in a previous chapter. We tested it. We looked at it. We said nationalism could do a lot of things. It was a driving force behind Italian and German unification. But who remembers what was the effect that nationalism is going to have on empires? That's where we're back to. And so nationalism is going to be something that affects these empires. And remember, we said all these involved countries here at this point were empires. How is nationalism going to affect them? I told you that Gavrilo Princip was a Serbian nationalist. So there's your connection right there. And they wanted Serbian independence, and for that matter, even though Serbia had gained their independence, they wanted to maintain Slavic independence. And other Slavic groups and nations, the Bosnians, the Croatians, etc., were still part of the Austrian Empire. Anyway, the Black Hand carried out this assassination. I'll try to link a video later following this that will be assigned as part of a separate assignment that kind of takes you through the steps of the assassination. For the most part, Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the throne, was visiting Sarajevo, and in Sarajevo, he had kind of basically gotten in this open motor, convertible car, and they were, touring or driving through the city. There were several assassins sent, not just Gavrilo. They had sent 7 young men into Sarajevo that day to carry out the assassination. One had thrown a bomb at the car that Franz Ferdinand was in earlier in the day, and it had failed to explode under the Archduke's car, and it actually had damaged and injured the people behind them in the motorcade. In the modern world, that would have shut down everything. The Secret Service would have had the streets roped off, and if an attempt had been made, they would have flown the person out immediately or escaped somehow. But this is a very different time, and Franz Ferdinand continues on with his journey, his trip. And later in his drive through the town, he decides he wants to visit the hospital where the people who had been injured were staying. And his driver takes a wrong turn in the city. And so the driver pulls up and stops in the street and realizes he's taken a wrong turn. And in the cafe where the car had stopped, right in front of that cafe, was Gavrilo Princip, who looked out the window and he saw his target. Gavrilo actually had kind of given up on the attempt because he didn't think Ferdinand was going to drive by where he had been. And so he had left his original point that he was supposed to be at, and now, just by dumb luck, his target shows up right there, just on an off chance. And so Princip took his opportunity. He went and shot Franz Ferdinand and his wife to death, which is the beginning point of this sequence that we're going to now get into to the war. Okay, now there's several things that we need to understand. Okay, and one is that Serbia was an independent country, and so when Franz Ferdinand is assassinated, the Austrians are going to be pretty upset about this. Okay, and that's something that we need to understand is the Austrian emperor was a very old man. He was in his 80s at the time. He was incredibly conservative and really from an earlier era. And he and the Austrians are outraged, and they hold Serbia accountable. And they say the Serbian government has helped the Black Hand with their activities, and they perpetuated and aided this assassination attempt. So Austria wants to declare war immediately. And Serbia is a small country nearby, all right? And they have no friends except for one. And as we look at this, right, we have Mother Russia, right? The basic idea here is that the Serbs are Slavs, and so are the Russians. And so the Russians saw themselves as the protector of all Slavic peoples, including the Serbs. So when Austria is threatening Serbia, Russia takes it upon themselves to get involved and say they are going to back Serbia in this instance, in this crisis that's emerging. Now, no war has been declared yet, all right, but it is looking like that's going to come into play very soon, okay? So here are the alliances. We'll skip this for now. Don't worry about these right now. We can come back to them. You'll see these play out later, so just for now, just hold off. We'll come back. I think what would be nice now is to just sequence the events that occur, and then really we'll be pretty much done for today. Okay. Number one. Okay. Number one. Let me find it here. Number one. Right here is going to be Austria-Hungary, and they are going to be upset at Serbia. Okay. Serbia. So this is number one that we need to understand is Austria-Hungary is upset at Serbia because of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and holding them accountable. That brings in Russia, right? That brings in Russia. This is number two. Okay, number two. Russia is going to be supportive of Serbia. So they're going to look at, whoops, undo that. Okay, they are going to be supportive of Serbia. So if Austria invades Serbia, Russia will come to Serbia's aid as Slavic brothers and sisters. Now, if you'll remember, this takes us back to, and this is where the alliance system kicks in. If you'll remember, Austria-Hungary was allied with which two countries? Do you remember what it was called? Okay, exactly. We have the Triple Alliance. We have, then this is number three. Okay, number three is going to be what? It's going to be the Germany kicking in its support of Austria-Hungary. Now, Germany didn't necessarily want a war, especially over Serbia or the assassination, but Austria was dead set on getting revenge for what had happened. And so, basically, to make a long story short, Austria sent a message to Germany, to Kaiser Wilhelm, saying, do we have your support in this upcoming conflict? And Germany basically said, and this is, the historians call it, kind of Germany wrote a blank check, right? They wrote a blank check to Austria, said, yes, we'll support you in whatever you do. Now, Germany didn't necessarily want a war, especially at that time, but the way they worded the message back to Austria, the Austrians took it as, go ahead and do what you need to do, and we got your back. That's where number three comes in, is Austria invades Serbia, Russia kicks in and says, here we go. And so that kicks Germany in, and that's number three, right? Is now Germany is fighting Russia with Austria-Hungary, who is fighting Serbia. So we have Russia and Serbia fighting Germany and Austria-Hungary because of this assassination. But wait, there's more. You have number four. You'll remember, number four, that Russia was part of the Triple Entente, and with France and England. Now, as we're going to find out, because you might ask yourself a question, what about these guys? Why haven't I said anything about them? I thought they were part of the Triple Alliance, Coach Duclos, you're saying. But Italy almost immediately says, yeah, we're part of the Triple Alliance. No, we're not going to participate in this, right? They're not down with Austria's attack on Serbia, and so Italy basically pulls out. You'll notice on this map that it's listed as an allied power. So yes, Italy not only doesn't fight for the Austrians, they switch sides and fight for the allied powers, right? But at this point, we're still talking about the alliances. There's a difference between saying the Triple Alliance, which is Germany, Austria, and Hungary, and the Central Powers, which are Germany, Austria, and we haven't even gotten to Turkey yet. We'll talk about the Ottoman Empire later. Allied powers and Central Powers are words we use to describe the conflicting sides once the war started. The alliances, Triple Alliance, Triple Entente, are words we use to describe the pre-war political alliances, the way military alliances as they were set up. So, like we said, France was part of the Triple Entente, and after Russia and Germany begin this war, France is now obligated to fight the Germans as well, and well, to the Austrians too. But you'll notice there's no real way for France and Austria to directly fight, because there is neutral Switzerland right here in between the two. Okay, so that's kind of where we're looking at right now. We have, because of the assassination, and just to review, we have Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia, Russia protecting their Slavic brothers, declare war on Austria. Germany is part of the Triple Alliance, declares war on Russia. Italy drops out of the Triple Alliance. France declares war on Germany. So now you'll notice Germany is in a has a bit of a problem, right? They are now fighting a war on two fronts, okay? And that's the problem that we'll look at next, is that the German high command realizes this. They are not stupid. They understand we are fighting one direction, we are fighting two directions, and that is not an ideal situation, okay? And so that brings us to the last stage, is how can Germany get out of this war as fast as possible? They realize that they have a huge Russia and a very powerful France on either side of them, and that the longer the war goes, the more likely it is that the bigger countries near them that surround them will win that war. So the idea here becomes, how can we knock the Allies out of the war quickly? And the answer becomes something, well, you can think about it this way, all right? German High Command looks at their options. We have two enemies. We have, on one side of us, we have France, and the other side we have Russia. So how do we get this fight to a one-on-one conflict, right? We don't want a two-on-one conflict where we're surrounded. So we need to knock one of these out first. So the question would be, which one is more likely to be knocked out first? The answer, of course, would be France. Okay, this is the country that's more likely to be knocked out. Just look at the map. Here is the distance to Moscow. Here is the distance to Paris. Okay, so in German high command, okay, during the pre-war years, because Germany was making plans, they were all making plans way before the war was started. They had sat and planned all of it. Okay, and the Germans came up with a plan called the Schlieffen Plan, which it'll be on the next slide. The Schlieffen Plan basically said, if we are going to, if we are going to fight one of the two, we're going to fight, this one. Sorry. The main conflict is going to be, let's attack France, knock them out of the war, okay? But to do so, the French army, they're going to have to march right through this border area where the French army is located. So you tell me, right? Would you rather march through this heavily defended border, where you see the border right here between France and Germany, where the French army knows they're going to attack, or, and this is where the plan comes in, the Schlieffen Plan, attack through Belgium and then take Paris from that direction, okay? The French army is down here and defending the border, and then the German army is going to move through Belgium. Now, Belgium had their own army, and Belgian neutrality was guaranteed by England. So the Germans would have to choose, attack the Belgian army in Belgium or attack the French army in France, knowing that if they attack Belgium, they will pull England into the war. Well, they decide to do option number two. They're going to take the risk of attacking through Belgium, and they are going to risk England becoming part of the war, as we learned with Italy. Just because they were part of the alliances doesn't mean that they had to necessarily fight. England's priority was its colonies, so it wasn't necessarily going to get involved. But Belgian neutrality was something the English had guaranteed, and so the Schlieffen Plan guaranteed that they would become involved in the war. So here is the Schleifen plan right here. Um, that's all you need to know for here. We are not going to worry about these right now. And with the Schleifen plan in effect, the war has begun. And obviously, the Schleifen plan failed because of the Battle of the Marne down here. The 6-week victory the Germans had hoped for was impossible now, and they were stuck fighting a two-front war. We will talk more about how the war plays out with objective number 2, which is how warfare changed, and we will pick that up with a later lesson. So thank you for being patient with me. This is the first time I've done one of these, so I might try it again. I'm sure I'll get better at it, but anyway, we are all learning together as we go through this distance learning, and I will talk to you guys later.